Keep calm, carry on, then sound the bloody alarm, because the United Kingdom's new Strategic Defence Review is the biggest overhaul of their military in over a generation, aimed at preparing for war to deter it from happening in the first place. I read the 144-page government document so that you don't have to, and it outlines their plan to radically transform each branch of the armed forces and invest billions of dollars into a new hybrid drone navy, additional munition plants, fighter jets, and thousands more personnel. That smells like defense contracts. In fact, all the 32 European NATO members just met and pledged to reach 5% defense spending by 2035, which means Britain will rearm at a pace not seen since the Cold War. Why is that? Fortunately, the Defense Review itself spells out their justification so that the slower kids in the back of the class like myself can understand. Russia's mentioned 33 different times in the document. The British Prime Minister says in its intro pages, Russia's waging war on our continent and probing our defenses at home. The Secretary of Defense goes on to say the growing Russian aggression, new nuclear risks, and daily cyber attacks at home. You guys, I'm no genius, but I think the UK and Europe might just be a tad bit concerned about Russia. From the UK government's point of view, the Kremlin has increased defense spending by 70% in just 2 years. That's 43% of their total spending is now linked to the Russian military-industrial complex. New satellite photos show Russian troops establishing an artillery base just 100 kilometers from Finland's border, with 2,000 Russian soldiers stationed there. Isn't that just some cheeky, jolly good fun? A British intelligence agency warned that Russian state-backed groups were actively embedding themselves into UK power stations, internet providers, and water treatment plants, placing kill switches in them to be activated in the event of a conflict. And any number of different scenarios could trigger a situation where Britain deploys troops in Europe. So the question is Britain prepared for war? Britain, with its population of 68 million people and a hefty GDP of over $3 trillion, are extremely important to the alliance. They're the 6th largest economy and the 6th highest defense spender in the entire world. Its geography makes it a kind of unsinkable aircraft carrier right on the doorstep of Europe, which means that it's a gateway to the Arctic and a key outpost to the Atlantic for anti-submarine Russian warfare. The UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of only 2 nuclear powers in all of Europe, and their MI6 intelligence capabilities are regarded as the top 3 best in the world. Meanwhile, former American generals and British officials have stated that the UK is unprepared to fight against a larger nation. This Strategic Defense Review itself even agrees with that assessment and does a self-burn, saying, quote, the current British military is better suited as a peacetime force, and that they're not optimized for warfare against a pure military state. Some of the most widely covered criticisms of the British military is that their army only has roughly 157 operational main battle tanks and that there are only 73,000 active duty troops currently. How can Britain be so powerful and have so many challenges at the same time? To better understand this, I spoke with expert former British infantry officer Nicholas Drummond, who advises and works with the British government in military acquisition.
And I think the real watershed moment for the army was the end of the Cold War in 1990, and we saw no real investment after that time, and existing equipment was simply parked in barracks and allowed to rust in peace.
Today, we're going to examine how the British military shrank to its smallest point in over 300 years since the Napoleonic Wars, and if these historic changes to their defense posture will be able to deter war with Russia. This story about how NATO members just met and agreed to devote 5% of GDP to defense spending was covered with a lot of bias from all sides in the media, I think. And that's why I partnered with Ground News, because they're the best tool for me to stay objective with my reporting. Ground News is an app and a website that pulls in news coverage from around the world and puts it in one place so you can see how every angle of a story is being told. It shows us how out of over 700 different publications covering this story about NATO, it leans slightly left on the spectrum. spectrum. Ground news visually identifies and tags if the source is right or left-leaning, and if it's independent, private equity, or a media conglomerate. It's this kind of transparency that even managed to get my dad to start being more sympathetic to hearing the other side out. Because I believe in ground news so much, we're offering 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use to just $5 a month. If you're news curious like I am, click the link in the description or go to ground.news/Cappy or scan the QR code to get a clearer understanding of the world. A nation that forgets its past has no future. The reason Britain is proposing such a massive change to their military is similar to what happened to many nations after the end of World War II. Decades of reduced funding with some mismanaged budgets mixed in there. At the absolute height of World War II, Britain's back was legitimately up against the wall. They were suffering a brutal bombing campaign from the Nazis, forcing them to ration food. Therefore, by the end of World War II, there were over 5 million British personnel serving across the branches, or about 25% of the entire male population.
So between World War II and 1990, we had a very strong set of military capabilities, and that's gradually been shrunk over time.
Defense spending peaked at about 50% of GDP during the war. It cost the UK around £1 trillion, which was the equivalent of about 200% of its GDP at the time. Britain had to sell off about a quarter of their overseas assets, and it became heavily reliant on US loans. Demobilization, though, started right after World War II, and by 1948, they were down to about 1 million personnel in their forces. But the threats weren't over for them. They couldn't relax that easily. The Soviet Union's border in East Berlin was only 570 miles or 920 kilometers away from London in the UK. That's like the distance from New York to North Carolina was where Soviet troops were positioned for them. This is why British troop levels during the 1950s had to remain high at about 800,000. I would argue one of the most influential people on British national defense strategy at this time was Field Marshal Montgomery, who was a famous World War II tank commander, and he argued for a strong armored force that was forward deployed in Europe. He wrote in his memoir, "I was deeply concerned that the British Army was being allowed to run down too fast. The danger was that we would end up with an army that appeared respectable but could not be relied upon in war." Montgomery was instrumental in the creation of what was called the British Army of the Rhine, which was 60,000 British troops and 800 main battle tanks forward deployed in West Germany against Soviet Union. He said, quote, "The British Army of the Rhine must be a real fighting force, not a token presence. It must have enough men and tanks to face the Soviet threat on the ground. Only then can it serve as an effective deterrent," end quote.
Something I read about and just learned about very recently was the British Army of the Rhine.
Yeah, so back then, we had a core-size force in Germany of 55,000, and that was 3 armoured divisions, an artillery division, a substantial force, all armoured, positioned within 4 hours of their deployment zones. And when you contrast what we have today, it's very different.
That's interesting. That's sort of what it feels like the British military would like to be able to do once again today.
Any wise, pound foolish. However, everything changed when in 1953, the United Kingdom gave birth to their first nuclear weapon. Allow me to introduce you to the man with the new National Defense Plan. Duncan Sandys. Sandys was a former World War II naval commander and then Minister of Defense. He led the creation of the Defense White Paper of 1957. It's the direct predecessor of today's Strategic Defense Review that we're going to get into. It was one of the most consequential documents in British military history, and you could argue one of the most radical defense policy shifts for them ever that we're still feeling to this day. The paper outlined how Britain believed a battle with the Soviet Union would be carried out by nuclear weapons and would ultimately be on the American Air Force to win. So they planned to reduce the size of the British Army and Air Force drastically and focus on their Navy. The white paper called for ending conscription by 1963. It set a precedent that Britain would rely on nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet aggression, which would allow them to minimize their expansive, large standing conventional forces. It was a have my cake and eat it too kind of moment, where they could still defend against the Soviet Union while not maintaining a large, expensive standing army.
I mean, you're absolutely right. People justified nuclear weapons saying if we had a nuclear capability, we would not need such large and significant land forces. And I think to a certain extent, That's true. But if you really lose any significant conventional capabilities, then nuclear weapons become your only recourse. So really, we do need land forces for some kind of scaled escalation.
This marked the point at which Britain acknowledged that it could no longer afford to maintain a global military presence on the scale required to defend its vast colonial empire. Troop levels started to sharply decline to about 350,000, and defense spending fell to 5% by the 1970s. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, the British government, like most NATO members, saw this as the long-awaited peace dividend. With no existential threat on the horizon, they started slashing defense budgets left and right. They reduced force structure and closed overseas bases. The British Army of the Rhine was formally disbanded in 1994. By the mid-1990s, British regular forces were down to around 220,000 personnel, and the trend of downsizing would continue year after year. London had once again become one of the world's premier financial hubs. At the same time, the UK was still involved in a number of high-tempo operations, from peacekeeping in Bosnia to air operations over Kosovo. They were doing more with less, and at first, they made it work. British forces maintained their highly professional and well-respected reputation on the world stage, and the UK joined the United States in the global war on terror, committing tens of thousands of troops to Afghanistan and Iraq.
After 9/11, the army was reconfigured around MRAPs for counterinsurgency operations, not heavy armor for fighting a peer adversary. And we've really suffered there. So Challenger numbers have really sunk to a very low level.
By 2010, regular British Army strength had dropped to 100,000, and total defense spending was sitting at about 2.5% of GDP, on a downward trend. Even while defense budgets were slashed, they were still responsible for some of the world's most innovative inventions in the defense world, including Chobham armor, N-Law anti-tank missiles, and long-range Storm Shadows. Then came the 2010 Strategic Defense and Security Review, which was conducted in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. The review marked another major inflection point. The UK government announced deep cuts across all three services, driven by financial constraints. Most notably, we saw the regular British Army cut to 82,000 troops, and the Harrier fleet and aircraft carrier was retired. The UK still had a world-class nuclear submarine force and special forces, but the depth, mass, and sustainability of the force had been hollowed out. By the late 2010s, respected defense analysts and even British generals began to publicly warn that the UK was no longer capable of fighting a sustained war against a peer adversary. But who the heck cared at the time? There seemed to be no credible, massive threat against them.
It was a decade where there was really no grand strategy. Figured out what we wanted the British Army to do or how it should be organised. And this was because there was no real threat at that time.
Years of underfunding, a focus on counterinsurgency over conventional warfare, and political indecision had taken its toll. If the enemy doesn't kill you, bureaucracy will. However, by 2021, the government published another white paper called the Integrated Review, which saw the Army shrink to where it stands today at just about 73,000 regular soldiers, its smallest size in over 300 years, when the population was 4 times smaller. Defense spending was now at its lowest point of 2.2% GDP. The British Army, once capable of deploying over 400,000 soldiers in the continental Europe, was now reduced to a single deployable division, reliant on US logistical support.
And we have just 14 artillery systems, 14 155mm guns. That's astonishing. And I personally believe that's way too low. So I'd like to see us have 4 regular tank regiments and 2 reserves, and that's probably around 300 tanks.
You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Then the world was shocked. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was taken as a wake-up call by the United Kingdom. And the problems started pouring in now, as a report by the National Audit Office found that the British military ammo stockpiles were so low, they were forced to reduce donations to Ukraine. They concluded that further donations of lethal aid would pose unacceptable risks to the UK military's readiness, and would take 10 years to replace. Ben Wallace, the UK's former defense secretary of 2023, said said the armed forces had become hollowed out and underfunded. In February 2024, the UK House of Commons Defence Committee published a report aptly titled "Ready for War?" In it, they assessed there were multiple shortfalls for large-scale combat operations, including not enough personnel and shortage of stockpile of munitions. The UK contributes a presence of forward-deployed 1,000 land forces and 2 squadrons of main battle tanks in Poland and Estonia, as well as air support for the region as part of Operation Gavrid. These are a tripwire force designed to hold up just long enough for American reinforcements to arrive. But the United States government has signaled that they may no longer shoulder the defense burden in Europe in the same way that they had for the past few decades. Which brings us to 2025 and this brand spanking new Strategic Defense Review. And it outlines 62 acceptable recommendations that will prepare Britain for war. After reading through the document, the big giant bottom line up front is, I think, summed up in one word: the Navy. Britain is investing heavily in a hybrid drone navy, based on the success of Ukraine's maritime attack drones that they have. The reason for this investment is because the Royal Navy today only has 14 destroyers and frigates, many of which have maintenance and operational problems, and that number will now increase to 25. The HMS Prince of Wales aircraft carrier also had maintenance issues that will now get new renovations and investment. These naval forces will be what's called Europe First or NATO First investment that the UK plans to mainly distribute to its NATO allies. The UK currently has 10 submarines that'll increase to 22, which is where their ability to launch nuclear weapons lies. These will be continuously built, with one being pumped out every 18 months. The reason why the UK is focusing on their navy at the expense of other branches is partly because of something called the GEOC gap, which is the strategic naval bottleneck choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. The gap being the 2 stretches of open ocean among these 3 land masses. It's one of Earth's most sexy natural forming thigh gaps. This is the front line for the Royal Navy to monitor and intercept Russian submarines as they try to come in from the Kola Peninsula into the Atlantic Ocean. This region is vital for NATO logistics and forces coming from America. This natural geographic water obstacle that has existed throughout history is a huge part of the reason why the UK has always focused resources on their navy.
I was expecting there to be more investment into the army and into tanks. And I don't know, I'm trying to understand kind of what the thinking is.
Yeah, so the strategy that seems to be emerging is that, look, we're based in the UK, we can't deploy to Europe quickly, but let's leave the land stuff to Poland and Germany, and let's focus on the stuff we can do, which is the naval stuff and the air stuff. And I think that is a sensible strategy.
In 1713, Britain took control of the Strait of Gibraltar when they tactically acquired it from war with Spain. The Strait of Gibraltar is one of the most important strategic maritime choke points on Earth. 30% of the global seaborne oil transits this narrow 8-mile wide choke point that links Europe, Africa, and Asia. So this outpost here is crucial to denying adversaries access from the Mediterranean and to keep allied logistics flowing freely. And the UK is responsible for it. The UK's air force is at about 107 fighter jets, a mix of F-35s and Typhoons that are being retired. The new plan will increase to 74 more F-35s, an additional drone wingmen, and a 6th-generation aircraft known as the Tempest on the horizon. And this gets us to the most controversial part, the British Army. The Army is getting the least amount of focus based on the strategic priorities, but it's not without any love. The UK plans to spend £6 billion to build 6 new munition factories that'll procure 7,000 long-range missiles and a constant supply of shells. This is part of what they're calling their defense dividend. which is a turn of phrase on the peace dividend. They say the defense spending will create thousands of new jobs and help boost the economy. The plan is to increase personnel by 30,000 to 100,000 soldiers in the army. The document outlines a key concept of their ground forces. The infantry needs to be 10 times more lethal, they say, and that's the key phrase. If someone asked me to be 10 times more better at my job, I'd probably say, but how? Am I getting 10 times more resources? But no, you're getting drone swarms and AI software to make up for it. This is how they get to have their cake and eat it too. The answer isn't just nukes this time, it's drones. The defense review states that infantry units will go by what's called a 20-40-40 mix, which is kind of a fascinating theory. The US military appears to be going in a similar direction, in fact, and militaries around the world are going this way. It breaks down as follows: 20% crewed platforms like your tanks, IFVs, your human operators, 40% high-end, reusable, uncrewed platforms like autonomous drones that can survive multiple missions, and 40% expendable consumables, which is like loitering munitions, kamikaze, single-use drones. The end result is the UK force plans to be 80% unmanned. This is a heavy reliance on drones.
Is this new Martyr tank initiative, and that is main armored tank of Europe to rebuild main battle tank capacity, and that will see maybe as many as 4,000 new tanks acquired, and that will give us a mass of main battle tanks, enabling us to really take the fight to Russia.
But here is what I think explains all of this the best. Nuclear weapons are extremely expensive to maintain. Their strategy has evolved to a strategic logic that I would like to call do what others can't, which is keeping that nuclear button working, and that button is a lot more expensive than you might think. The new Dreadnought-class ballistic missile submarine will be an investment around $30 billion plus a $10 billion contingency, and it starts to become clear why the UK can't afford a giant standing army.
Yeah, I would summarize it really. It's a triumph of ambition over substance. You know, it's all, hey, these are all the things we want to do, not these are all things we're going to do. I always think, compare the challenge of rebuilding UK defence. It's like the roof of a house. You know, every year you lose tiles from the roof and you have to replace them. And if you have a program of always replacing roof tiles, then the roof will last indefinitely. But if you leave it and do nothing for 30 years, you eventually reach a point where you have to replace the whole roof, and that's always much more expensive than the incremental taking care of it. And that's where we are in the UK.
While Britain's new defense strategy may be wrapped in drones, nukes, and frigates in the Navy, at its core, it's a blunt admission, I think. The age of peace dividends is over, and the UK is gearing up for real war, one that could reach from the trenches to our tap water. If you want to get more content, I just launched my new show, Simple Sabotage, with my buddy Patrick, on our new channel. Link is in the description. We cover hour-long deep dives into exciting military stories there. If you're looking to support the work that we do at this channel, you can grab our new Tank Evolution t-shirt. It's available on our merch store. Just go to www.cappyarmy.com where you can get sources, show notes, and exclusive content.